In the next 3 months, 200 men died in bleeding Kansas. The killing would not stop for 10 years. In 18, Dred Scott, even though he had lived for many years on free soil. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney said a black man had no rights a white man was bound to respect.
As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. Soon, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Abraham Lincoln.
Violence reached the floor of the United States Senate, where Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina savagely beat abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner with his cane. Meanwhile, the nation's chief executive, James Buchanan, did nothing.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. It will become all one thing, or all the other.
So whether you want to or several missing teeth replaced, LA Dentist Group Team Specialists will restore your smile. And you can do it in one day and while you sleep. If you already have implants that have gone south or complications, another dentist, documents are trying to fix those problems.
On Sunday evening, October 16, 1859, 13 whites into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He brought along a wagon load of guns to arm the slaves he was sure would rally to him. Once they had, he planned to lead them southward, along the crest of the Appalachians, and destroy slavery. Brown was an inept businessman who had failed 20 times. He believed himself God's agent on earth. In 1856, at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, he and his sons had hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death with broadswords, legions. Brown and his men quietly seized the armory, arsenal, and engine house, and took up hostages, including George Washington's great-grandnephew. After that, nothing went right. The first person killed was the town baggage master, a free black. The slaves did not rise up. Angry townspeople did. The first of Brown's followers to fall was Dangerfield Newby, a former slave. On Tuesday morning, federal troops arrived from Washington, led by a U.S. Army Colonel, Robert E. Lee. These men stormed the engine house, and 9 more of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown, severely wounded, was turned over to Virginia to be tried for treason.
An undivided South says, let him pay. Albany, Georgia patriot.
Virginia found Brown guilty and sentenced him to death. Among the troops at the scene of his hanging were cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, led by an eccentric professor, Thomas young actor named John Wilkes Booth.
December 2nd, 1859. Old John Brown has been slavery wrong. That cannot excuse violence, bloodshed, and treason. It could avail him nothing that he might think himself right. Abraham Lincoln.
Ralph Waldo Emerson likened Brown to Christ. A note. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood.
His zeal in the cause of freedom was infinitely superior to mine. Mine was as the taper light. His was as the burning sun. I could live for the slave. John Brown died. John Brown, very accepted. He becomes the militia system in the South, which had been a joke before then, becomes a viable instrument. As the Southern militias begin to take a true war, the South begins to worry about.
It was the beginning of the Confederate Army.
Becoming more general. Men are now beginning to talk of it seriously, who 12 months ago hardly permitted themselves to think of it. The crisis.
The country was coming apart and nominated Abraham Lincoln, a moderate. His platform pledged only to halt slavery's further spread.
On that point, hold firm, as with a chain of steel. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it.
Radical abolitionists in the North complained that Lincoln's opposition to slavery did not go far enough. But to most people in the South, the Prosty campaign had become a referendum of the Southern way of life. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with only 40% of the vote. He did not even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states.
All in this country. But the mischief is done. The only relief for the American people is to shorten sail, send down the topmast, and prepare for a hurricane.
In the South, Lincoln was burned in effigy. Now, the South Carolina legislature called for a convention to consider seceding from the Union.
Southerners would have told you they were fighting for self-government. They believed the gathering of power in Washington was against them. Southerners saw the election of Lincoln as a sign that the Union was about to be radicalized and that they were about to be taken in directions they did not care to go. The abolitionist aspect of it was very strong. And they figured they were about to lose what they call their property and face ruin.
It was madness. South Carolina, one Southern politician wrote, is too small for a republic. And too large for an insane asylum. 1860. A most gloomy day. Stocks fall. George Templeton Strong. In New York, emotions were no less explosive. George Templeton Strong, a conservative lawyer who distrusted chicken disguised in eagle feathers. We have never been a nation. We are only an aggregate of communities, ready to fall apart in the first series. 3 states in the Union. In the 34th, free Kansas was about to join. By the time of his inauguration 5 months later, just 27 states would remain. Rise.
This was the battle with the law. And this is what
South Carolina led the way on December 20th. A bell in Charleston told it strong.
Charleston Mercury. The tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated.
After South Carolina seceded, the handful of federal troops still stationed in Charleston withdrew to Fort Sumter, far out in the harbor. Their commander, Major Robert Anderson, said he had moved his men in order to prevent the effusion of blood. They were quickly surrounded by rebel batteries.
Thank God we have a country at last.
On February 18th, a few minutes after noon, Jefferson Davis stood on the steps of the Alabama State House at Montgomery. He took the oath of office as President of the Provisional Confederate States of America. The crowds cheered, wept, sang "Farewell to the Star-Spangled Banner" and "Dixie," a minstrel tune written by a Northerner. He was brittle, nervous, often unable to sleep, and partly blind in one eye. Accustomed to being obeyed, he scorned the bargaining that made democratic government work. Sam Houston said he was as cold as a lizard and ambitious as Lucifer. But he had been educated at West Point, fought in Mexico, and served as Secretary of War. As senator from Mississippi, he resisted secession. He and his wife, Verena, were there, clipping roses in the garden, when word came that he had been elected president.
Reading that telegram, he looked so grieved that I feared some evil had befallen our family. After a few minutes, he told me, as a man might speak of the sentence of death.
Upon my head were showered smiles, plaudits, and flowers. But beyond them I saw troubles and removal. Jefferson Davis.
The Confederate Constitution was almost identical to the United States Constitution, but it gave the president a line-item veto, a 6-year term, and it outlawed international slave trading. The Confederate cabinet met for the first time in a hotel room. A sheet of stationery pinned to the door marked the president's office. "Where will I find the State Department?" a visitor asked Robert TRUMAN, Secretary of State. "In my hat, sir, and the archives in my coat pocket."
Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man.
But ours is a monstrous system. Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes want themselves patterns, models of husbands and fathers.
Carolina, moved among the highest circles of the Confederacy, were close to Jefferson Davis and his wife. Mary was subject to depression and nightmares, for which she sometimes took opium. Now she too began to keep a diary.
This journal is intended to be entirely objective. My subjective days are over.
Flattened and wide projecting ears stands out from the face with an inquiring, anxious air, as though it was sniffing for some good thing in the wind. The eyes, dark, full, and deeply set, are penetrating, but full of an expression which almost amounts to tenderness. William Russell, London Times.
Illinois, for his capital.
Here I have lived a quarter of a century, and brethren have been born and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether I cannot fail. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me. I bid you an affectionate farewell.
En route to Washington, the president's train stopped at Cleveland, Buffalo, Albany, and New York. In Philadelphia, warned of plots to kill him, Lincoln declared he would rather be assassinated than see a single star removed from the American flag. 2 days later, he reluctantly canceled plans for a grand arrival in Washington and slipped into the capital by train at dawn, wrapped in a shawl and protected by 2 armed guards. Inauguration Day in Washington was cloudy and cold. A large, tense crowd gathered beneath the unfinished dome. Cannon guarded the Capitol grounds. Sharpshooters lined the roof. Lincoln promised not to interfere with slavery. He denied the right of any state to secede, vowed to defend federal installations, and spoke directly to the South.
In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies.
Well, thanks for writing, Gary.
Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of...
I do not pretend to go to sleep. How can I? If Anderson does not accept terms at 4, the orders are he should be fired upon. I count chimes. I begin hope. The heavy booming of a cannon, I sprang out of bed and on my knees prostrate. I prayed as I have never prayed before.
The Civil War began at 4:30 a.m. on the 12th of April, 1861, Fort Sumter. At that hour, only a dark shape out in Charleston Harbor. Confederate Commander Beauregard was a gunner, so skilled on as an assistant for another year. That instructor was Major Robert Anderson, Union commander inside Fort Sumter.
Years is voiced in the thunder of these cannon, and the people seem almost beside themselves in the exaltation of a freedom they deem already won.
A Virginia farmer and editor who had preached secession for 20 years. Of course, he said, I was delighted to perform the service. It was a bloodless opening to the bloodiest war in American history. The first gun that was fired at Fort Sumter sounded the death knell of slavery. They who fired it were the greatest practical abolitionists this nation has produced.
April 13th. So Civil War is inaugurated.
14 April, Montgomery Daily Advertiser. The intelligence that Fort Sumter has surrendered to the Confederate forces yesterday sent a thrill of joy to the heart of every true friend of the South. The face of every Southern man was brighter, his step lighter, and his bearing prouder than it had been before.
In Boston, jubilant volunteers marched past Faneuil Hall, eager to avenge Fort Sumter. In Baltimore, anti-Lincoln men rampaged through the streets. In Richmond, a mob marched on the State House, tore down the Stars and Stripes, and raised the Stars and Bars. There was no longer any doubt that Virginia would secede. And in New York, 100,000 people crowded Union Square, where the Sumter flag now flew. Walt Whitman, sometime poet and journalist for the Brooklyn Standard, was stunned by the news. All the past we leave behind with Sumter, he said.
Woe to those who began this war if they were not in bitter earnest. Mary Chestnut.
Father and I were husking out corn when William Corey came across the field. He was excited and said, "Jonathan, the rebels have fired upon Fort Sumter." Father got white and couldn't say a word. Theodore F. Upson.
April 15th. Events multiply. The president is out with a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers. It is said 200,000 more will be called within a few days.
On the day Sumter fell, the regular arrest. Only 2 of its generals had ever commanded an army in the field, and both were long past their prime. Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican War, Old Fuss and Feathers, was too fat even to mount a horse. I've got the best suit of clothes I ever had in my life. In the North, they came by hundreds and by thousands. From Boston, Massachusetts, from Detroit and Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the rain. Whole towns signed up. The 10th Michigan Volunteer Infantry was made up of Flint boys. Their commander was the mayor. There were so many Bowery toes and 1,000 velvet-covered camp stools on which to sit and eat them. On his way to war, Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer, just 22 and less than a month out of West Point, where he graduated at the bottom of his class, stopped in New York to have himself fitted out with a splendid new uniform. Then went to a photographer. In Pawtuxet, Rhode Island, 19-year-old Elisha Hunt Rose left his job as a harness home.
We drilled all day and night. Standing before a long mirror, I put many hours of